All right. Now I wanted to talk to you today about the importance of physicality and chance in painting. As it says here, I think more clearly in terms of ideas when I'm examining the work of an artist that I admire. Okay, so I'd like to read you a couple of things by an artist who's been important to me, someone I tend to go back to again and again when I need to figure things out. I'm interested in the interconnectedness of things, and we're going to do I'm going to do another presentation for you on the interconnectedness of things, on interdisciplinary approaches to painting, and how painting is informed by ideas from outside of the world of painting. But in this particular presentation, I'd rather just focus specifically on poetry and on Charles Olson in particular, just to give you an idea of how ideas cross boundaries. Okay. So I do. I return to Olson again and again when I need to figure things out, when I need to think about things. Just if you think about it, painters are generally painters because they think in terms of pictures. Okay, images, the visual. Okay, there are very few painters that have written extensively about their ideas. One of the most important ones is probably Robert Motherwell. He was an abstract expressionist and one of the younger members of that crew. And he wrote extensively about surrealism and about the abstract expressionist movement and all the work of his peers and the world that they were living in. And that was great, but I found that I've gotten more from reading about poetry, about music, even dance. Okay, so I'd like to begin here with some ideas about the relationship between painting and poetry. The poet Charles Olson, this is him with a bird on his head. He was the rector of Black Mountain College, so it's all coming together from I don't know, from the mid '40s to about 1951. I think that was when it closed down. So he was the one who was in charge of the school when people like John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Willem de Kooning even, when they were there. Okay. Now, Olson, let me see. Now, I read this when I was a student, okay? It was a suggestion by the literary critic Harold Bloom in an Artforum article that if painting is going to survive into the next century, so this was 20 years ago, will painting survive into the 21st century was what he was asking. He was saying in this increasingly pluralistic art environment where painting is no longer the central force in the art world, that painting would do well to invoke poetry. This was his suggestion. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about poetry. Now, Stan Brakhage. Let me show you Stan Brakhage. This is Stan Brakhage. He's not a poet. He's the experimental filmmaker. He recently passed away, well, not recently, maybe 15 years ago, in Victoria, actually. He was living in Victoria. He had a radio program, though, years earlier in Colorado, where he taught for years. And on this program, one day he was talking about poetry, and he observed that it's fashionable these days to say that poetry has abandoned story altogether. Okay, now we've seen that in painting as well, in the 20th century painting that we were exploring. But he felt that this was not at all the case. Poetry, he said, has tried to find ways to tell stories that include everything and that depend a great deal on inference. Okay, and he cited the mid-20th century poet Charles Olson as one of the greatest such examples that he knew. Now, Charles Olson lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Here, this is Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's a beautiful seaside New England fishing town, one of the oldest established communities in the United States. And this is where Olson lived for about the last 20 years of his life and where he wrote his Maximus poems. Now, in the Maximus poems, he created a figure like every man from medieval drama, like morality play, but for the 20th century, called Maximus of Gloucester. Now, this figure, Maximus, carried the history or embodied everything about all the people in the history of Gloucester and all those in the immediate environment around him. Now, near Gloucester, there was a place called Dogtown, which Charles Olson said was one of the most beautiful places on earth. It was one of those places, he said, that you know is extraordinarily special, and which he was also watching being ruined. It was becoming modernized. He was watching the Gloucester, the Dogtown that he knew that had existed for generations. He was watching it slip away. Okay, so his focus was on this specific place. Now, he's talking about Gloucester, but from the point of view of someone whose thinking is very broad. He's concerned about Gloucester, but he believes that modernism in general is not going well. He thinks the world is a mess. Okay, this is the 1960s, right? Gloucester is his focus. He calls himself a localist, but his thinking is broader than that. Now, Olson is credited as being the first literary figure to use the word postmodern, and he uses it, with pertinence to contemporary discourse, but the word's use has changed, and now, of course, it can mean many things, right? Now, his position is that if we're going to move beyond the modern, and he thought we had to, okay, that we should examine the origins of human civilization. Okay, the archaic is the indispensable other on the pathway from the present, is what he said. And by that he means as we move into the future, okay? He believes that the deeper we return to our archaic, primordial, pre-rationalist condition, the further beyond modernism that we will advance. Now, by modernism, he doesn't mean the 20th century. Okay, for Olson, modern thinking begins with the Greeks in the West. Okay, with Plato, with the development of logic and systems of classification. This is where things began to go wrong for Olson. He thinks that there's something about the human condition that is not on track, and it began to go wrong over 2,000 years ago. Okay, so this is where he's coming from he has a focus on mythology and on ancient history. But again, he's a localist, and so his work is all about this place. It's all about Gloucester. Now, an example of his work, and this is Stan Brakhage speaking, okay? Back to Stan Brakhage, okay? In his radio show, okay? An example of his work, one of the poems that Dogtown gave him, one of the poems that Dogtown gave Olson out of its histories, is the story of a man named Mary. Now, Mary raised a little bull, and he fought with it every day as he grew up. He was matching his own strength to the strength of this bull. It was a way of building his own strength to match the bull's, right? He was a tough guy. Now, Olson wrote this poem, which reaches all the way back to the Hittites, maybe, or at least the Greeks, the Egyptians, with their sense of the sky and the earth and everything that he could bring to it, to expand a story with all the possible inferences that anybody could think of. Okay, so he uses the phrase possible inferences. Now, the poem that Brakhage is talking about, it's called Maximus from Dogtown, and it doesn't end well for Mary. Mary, he gets drunk, and he goes out at night to fight the bull, and it kills him. Okay, the bull tears him to pieces, and then the bull is puzzled, it didn't know that it had the power to do that, and eventually the earth opens up her robe and takes Mary into it. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful poem. Now, it's not that the poem taps into anything universal. Remember, the abstract expressionists were talking about tapping into this universal relationship between human beings and pure color in order to reveal fundamental human emotions that cross cultural boundaries, that were universal, right? He says it's not necessarily that Charles Olson, in this poem about Mary and the bull, is tapping into anything universal. He said, I don't think that's it. Olson himself calls himself a localist. It's more about specificity. How if you go deep enough into anything, you're going to end up with something that matters. Now, there's a story about Olson, how he once advised a student at Black Mountain College, where he was teaching, that if this student was serious about being a writer, that he should learn everything there is to know about a subject. And he meant you don't have to study writing. He meant you could just choose a subject, and it didn't matter what it was. Pick anything, but learn everything about it. Now, there's another situation to give you an idea of his process and to get to get finally to this idea of chance. Okay, the importance of chance in art making. We're going to talk about how it specifically works for painting, but this is a really beautiful example from poetry. Okay, now in Tom Clark's biography of Charles Olson, which he's attempting to deduce, to figure out how Olson's first Maximus poem came about, he says Olson was typing a letter. He had an idea, and he just spontaneously started writing verse. So he started just spontaneously writing his poem. And he typed the line around the bend of the next second. But Clark says that Olson hit the S key instead of the X key in the word next. Okay, accidentally turning the word next into the word nest. And he decided to retain the typo. Okay, he says, oh, I'm going to keep that in there. So from the nest mischance, the next thing that happens is that a key image comes out of it, the bird in the poem, which then immediately gets us to the seagulls of Gloucester and enables the poem to progress. So what he's describing here, the importance of embracing chance, of accepting chance, and spontaneity. We talked about spontaneity a lot with the abstract expressionists, with Jackson Pollock and his throwing the paint on the canvas and just letting it happen the way it's going to happen. Chance and spontaneity. This was something that was happening in other areas as well, of course. We're talking the mid-50s, and these ideas were in the air. The best example is probably Jackson Pollock. This is a Jackson Pollock. It's quite a beautiful one. This is called Number 1A from 1948. Now, as an example, in Jackson Pollock's comments on his painting at the time, there's an obvious parallel here. He said this. He says, "When I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. It's only after a sort of a get acquainted period that I see what I've been about. Okay, I have no fears about making changes, about destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It's only when I lose contact with the painting that the result will be a mess. Otherwise, there's pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well." Now, another a similar situation was clear in the work of John Cage in terms of just embracing chance. John Cage, the composer, we talked about him last time. This situation involved the introduction of chance factors and indeterminacy in his work, which began really in the 1950s. So these ideas were in the air and they were crossing boundaries. Again, here's an example of this in Cage's work. This is a piece called Imaginary Landscape Number 4 for 12 radios. When I say radios, I mean radios like this, 12 old-fashioned radios from the middle of the last century. 24 players or 24 performers and a conductor. Now, this was Cage's first composition to be based fully on chance operations. There are 12 radios on the stage. Each radio had 12 performers. Each radio had 2 performers, and there was a conductor. Now, the 2 performers were required to dial a specific frequency according to the score. Now, depending on the location of the performance or other factors, the music, the sounds coming from these radios on the stage would sound very different from performance to performance, and these differences were completely dependent upon chance. This is Marcel Duchamp. This is called 3 Standard Stoppages. It was made between 1913 and 1914, so around the same time as the early, the very famous ready-mades that we were looking at. Now, to make this piece, Duchamp dropped 3 1-meter-long pieces of thread from a height of 1 meter, and then he glued them onto strips of canvas in the position that they were in when they landed. Now, these canvases were then cut along the profile of each fallen thread and used to make 3 wooden measuring tools that would retain the 1 meter length and would standardize the random curves created by chance. The result is a set of deliberately useless measuring tools that poke fun at the scientific method. So again, these reveal a lot about Duchamp and his sense of humor, but he was quite serious in his, As an artist, he is as much a philosopher as an artist. He was asking questions about the nature of art and the nature of reality and the nature of how we think and how we see the world, and he was ahead of the game in many ways. This is. This is an exquisite corpse drawing. This is by Man Ray, Andre Breton, Yves Tanguay, and Max Maurice from 1928. Now, Exquisite Corpse. The Surrealists had a game which they liked because of its inherent dependency on chance. Exquisite Corpse was played by allowing the participants to take turns drawing sections of a body or, whatever they decided to draw. I think it was more often figurative. On a piece of paper that was folded. Okay, so they couldn't see the contributions of the other players. The resulting drawings were comical and often grotesque. The poet Simone Kahn said this about Exquisite Corpse. We were at once recipients of and contributors to the joy of witnessing the sudden appearance of creatures none of us had foreseen, but which we ourselves had nonetheless created. So, again, the idea here is that by embracing chance or by opening yourself up to, dealing with unforeseen situations, like Charles Olson typing the word nest accidentally instead of the word next, but the accident is what brought him to the next part of the poem, where he begins, because of the word nest, he begins to talk about the birds, the seagulls of Gloucester. And the poem is allowed to progress in that direction, the direction that essentially happened by accident. These drawings are the same. This is about finding ways to tap into, whether it's the subconscious or the unconscious or just randomness, to embrace possibilities that would not occur intentionally. Possibilities that may, in some way, reveal more about what it means to be alive in the world than anything that you could come up with intentionally. Okay, back to Jackson Pollock. Now, when I showed you this painting earlier, I said this is a beautiful one. But what is it? What is it that makes it beautiful? To get there, I'd like to read to you. Let me see. This is from Charles Olson's very influential and often quoted essay, "Projective Verse." I think this was written in 1952. This was an essay about his ideas on writing poetry. I'm paraphrasing. He said, if the poet or if the artist sprawl, he shall find little to sing but himself. If, on the other hand, the artist stays inside himself, if he is confined within his nature, as he is participant in the larger force, he will be able to listen. And his hearing, through himself, will give him secrets objects share. And by an inverse law, his shapes will make their own way. Now, this is just like Pollock's statement about the painting having a life of its own, right? Or the painting taking on a life of its own. And when it does, it turns out well. Olson said that an artist's problem is to give his work his seriousness, a seriousness sufficient to cause the thing he makes to try to take its place alongside the things of nature, so that the artist's act in the larger field of objects leads to dimensions larger than the artist. Okay, so we could say that one of the reasons I find this Jackson Pollock painting to be beautiful is because it successfully reflects the complexity of nature. Okay. This is it's a romantic idea that in the imagination there's and when I say romantic I mean it's from the Romantic period. Okay, the idea is that in the imagination there's evidence of a creative drive that's identical to that which produces natural forms. So if this creative impulse that spurs humans to engage in imaginative acts, art making, if this is the same as the creative force in nature that produces trees and clouds and animals, then the highest faculty of humans, the creative imagination, unites them with something, a force that runs through all of nature. Now again, Jackson Pollock, speaking about his work, you'll remember this, he said, "I do not represent nature, I am nature." I think this is what he meant. But if we're talking about art that reflects the complexity of nature, okay, it's not restricted to just these gestural abstract paintings that we're looking at. I think it can be applied to any very good painting, right? This is what very good paintings often do. I think they reflect this complexity that describes nature. This is a Rembrandt self-portrait from 1659. Now, chance in painting often has to do with the physicality of painting. The idea here is that an artist is never fully in control when painting. There's often a give and take between what's intended and then what occurs because of the physicality of the medium. With every mark, a painter is recording both the gesture, the intended gesture, and the medium's own properties, or what the paint wants to do, all at the same time. Here, this is a great example. Now, this is a close-up of this painting. You see, the self-portrait. We zoom in on the nose, and the experience of the painting becomes very different. When you look closely, you can see it's a very abstract situation, and it clearly represents a struggle between the artist and the paint. The artist wants to do something, and the paint wants to do other things. Okay, there's all kinds of marks here. There's little crumbly little bits of dried paint embedded in the surface. They look like pimples, but they're just little bits of dried paint that he's pushing around. There's things like these little scumbly, scratchy marks, and that's within the mustache, I believe. So, semi-intentional, semi-unintentional, regardless, clearly the paint is just doing what paint does. The artist is pushing it around, and the dynamic is one of intention and a kind of a random physicality that is difficult to control, that results in a surface that is complex. That's compelling because of its complexity. Now here's a detail of Jasper Johns' flag from 1955, which you guys are all familiar with. Sorry. Now I would argue that the thing that makes this painting compelling is the same thing that makes the Rembrandt self-portrait compelling. It's that when you get close, you see this interplay between intention and chance that again reflects an aspect of what it feels like to be alive. Right? We're not in control of what happens to us as people during our day, and if painting is going to speak to the human condition, if it's going to if part of its meaning has to do with how well it articulates the condition of being alive, well, chance. The embracing chance, using chance, goes a long way towards having painting realize those ambitions. There's always a tension in painting between the image that's being painted and the way that the work is painted, or the marks that actually make up the painting. It seems that there's a kind of a separation between the actual marks that are made by the artist and the picture that an artist chooses to paint. Always. Like, there's two ways of looking at that Rembrandt painting. You can stand back and look at the expression on his face. You can think about, the condition of the artist when he painted it and what it is he intended to communicate. Or you can get up close and you can look at the delicate interplay of marks the qualities of the painting, right? So what are we supposed to be looking at when we encounter the Jasper Johns flag? It's the same thing. Is it the image of the American flag, or is it the intricate interplay of intention and accident or chance? Okay, that's evident in the beautifully rendered marks that make up the surface of the painting, and I would argue that the brushwork in this painting, made in this case with beeswax. This is pigmented beeswax that he used to make this painting over a ground of newspaper clippings that he dipped into the wax, and the wax acted as a glue. We would stick the paper to the canvas, incorporating these little bits of collage, and then paint over it with the colored wax. It gave him this beautifully complex surface that again reflects the complexity of nature. And the complex surface that he achieved in this painting that so beautifully reflects the complexity of nature depends as much on chance as it does on the artist's intention, and that chance is wrapped up in the physicality of the paint and the propensity for the paint to behave according to the laws of physics. He said himself that he approached the flag as an object rather than as a symbol. He said this painting is no more about a flag than it is about a brushstroke or about a color or about the physicality of the paint. He said that in 1965. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I think we've covered it: physicality and chance in painting, and I'll see you next time. We'll talk about experimental mark making.